when he came to Yerevan and gave a speech calling for the rehabilitation of Yegesh, calling for the republication of the Armenian national writers Rafi and Patkanyan, and so on and so forth. He actually saw the Dazhnaks as betraying the Armenian national security by kind of flirting with Western powers, by flirting with the allies. We can say Abovian, Nalbandian, all these writers, they were under the influence of kind of the Russian revolutionary and Russian radical democratic tradition.
Բարև ձեզ, այսօր Մաքուր Պատմության հյուրներ, պատմաբան Պիետրո Շաքարյանը, ով վերջերս հրատարակել է այս փայլուն գիրքը Անաստաս Միկոյանի մասին, նա ստացել է իր տեխնացուական դոկտորատորան Օհայոյի համալսարանից, աշխատել է Սանկտ Պետերբուրգի տնտեսագիտության բարձրագույն դպրոցում, Վիշե շկոլ էկոնոմիկի, եւ հիմա Երևանում է, դասավանդում է Հայաստանի ամերիկյան համալսարանում։ Այսօր մենք խոսել ենք Անաստաս Միկոյանի մասին, հիմնականում կենտրոնանալով մի քանի դրվագի վրա իր կյանքից 1937 թվականի այդ հայտնի Հայաստանից գրված այդ նամակի վերաբերյալ ենք խոսել, նաև խոսել ենք իր դերի մասին Ստալինի պաշտամունքի անձի պաշտամունքի դեմ պայքարում, ապա ստալինականացման, դեստալինիզացիայի մասին ենք խոսել եւ շատ կարեւոր մի դրվագի մասին, որը շատ մեծ ուշադրության ցավոք սրտի մեր կողմից չի արժանացել, պատմագրության նկատի ունեմ 1954 թվականի իր ելույթից Երևանում, որը նաեւ շատ գործընթացների սկիզբ տվեց եւ նաեւ փորձել ենք հասկանալ ինչքան էր իր դերը Հայաստանի խորհրդային Հայաստանի կյանքում։ Արդյոք Միկոյանը միայն համամիութենական հայտնի գործիչ էր, թե նաեւ ուներ շատ մեծ ազդեցություն Հայաստանի խորհրդային Հայաստանի զարգացման վրա։ Անպայման դիտեք այս հաղորդումը, դիտեք նաեւ ոչ միայն մեզ YouTube-ում, այլ նաեւ մեր Telegram ալիքում, մեր Spotify-ով կարող եք լսեք եւ նաեւ եթե կարծում եք, որ մեր աշխատանքը դրա համար արժանի է, կարող եք մեկ օգնել Patreon-ում եւ Boosty-ում եւ այլ մյուս հարտակներում եւ նաեւ ինչպես մեր մոտ արդեն ավանդույթ է դարձել, մենք նվիրում ենք գիրք։ Մենք կնվիրենք այս գիրքը Անաստաս Միկոյանի մասին, Ստասնամին Անդրեյ Ռուբանով, սա գեղարվեստական գիրք է, բայց գրված է շատ փաստագրական նյութի վրա եւ նաեւ քանի որ Ստասնամինը ով թորներ Անաստաս Միկոյանը անձամբ մասնակցել է այս գիրքի ստեղծմանը, կա նաեւ շատ անձնական պատմություններ, շատ փաստաթղթեր հրապարակում են առաջին անգամ եւ այն թարգմանվել է մեր նաև նախորդ հաղորդումներից մեկի մասնակցի պատմական գիտությունների դոկտոր Խաչատուր Ստեփանյանի կողմից, ով եւ սիրով տրամադրել է այս գիրքը։ Այս գիրքը կստանա մենք խաղարկենք այս հաղորդման ներքևում ամենալավ մեկնաբանություն անող անձանց միջև եւ նաեւ այն անձանց միջև, ովքեր մեզ կմիանան մեր Patreon-ին կամ մեր հաղորդմանը ֆինանսապես կօգնի։ Շնորհակալություն, որ մեզ դիտում եք, շարունակեք սիրել պատմությունը։ Hello, Pietro.
Բարև ձեզ, ողջույն. Սուրեն, it's very great to be here on your show, finally, after all this time.
Yes,
and
we
now
discussed it for a long time, and it's a real pleasure to have you today, and we're going to be talking about perhaps the most famous, or certainly one of the most powerful Armenians of the Soviet era.
Yes, I would say, yes, absolutely.
About Anastас Միկոյան, and you know, a figure whose legacy is far from universally agreed upon.
Yes, absolutely.
And in Armenia we had a great sparkly debates about Anastас Микоյան, and now let's start discussing him, because you just finalized your book. It came out a month ago?
It came out a month ago in August 2025. That is the book, by the way, and also the cover is quite interesting for our viewers. This is a photograph of Anastас Mikoyan in Sanayin. He's back in his native village in 1962 during his visit to Armenia in 1962. And that was actually one of the things I found so interesting about my research going into Mikoyan, because I found actually that he was much more involved in Armenian affairs than many people assume.
Yeah, because we used to focus mostly on his Soviet legacy, not in Armenian one. And okay, but let's start from the beginning, the very beginning. Can you tell us about his childhood in the in this village of Sanain? Or I mean, how did his background at his years in Caucasus shape his character later, or of his political views?
Well, I mean, as you know, he was born in this village of Sanain, which at the time was part of the Tiflis gubernia. He came from a poor but loving Armenian family. His father was his father was a carpenter, and he also had, of course, as we know, I mean, he had, of course, his brother was Artyom Mikoyan, the famous aircraft designer. But this experience growing up, not only in terms of Sanain, but also in the Nersessian school in Tiflis, as we know, is a very, very famous school that produced, many famous Armenian national figures and revolutionaries going into the history, also artists. So Yerevan Kochar, as we can say, was another graduate from the Nersessian school, and also the Gevorgian Seminary at Echmiadzin. So all this affected who Mikoyan became, and also growing up in the Armenian context, and also in the context of the kind of the multi-ethnic Caucasus region, he understood the value of kind of difference and diversity. And this affected his career down the line when he's, like, for example, managing the diversity of the North Caucasus, and then later on we talk about the thaw period, which is actually really important because, again, in the Soviet discourse, in the Soviet kind of theoretical context, there was always this idea of the slianye concept, the idea of the merger of nations, that all nations, that national differences, national, I guess you could say specificity would begin to vanish, and you would have a kind of a united universal brotherhood. Yeah, Soviet, kind of a new Soviet man, I guess you could say. But Mikoyan rejected this idea of slianye, and in the party program of 1961, the third party program, he advocated substituting this with this idea of splizhenye, the idea of kind of rapprochement of nations, which basically said that yes, effectively we're kind of coming together as one Soviet people, but there are differences among us, and we should respect those differences. And that whole idea of respecting difference was not articulated first in 1961 or in 1958 when he advanced, how do I say this, when he, kind of was advancing his revisions to the party program. The idea of respecting difference really emerged from Mikoyan in 1954, when he came to Yerevan and gave a speech calling for the rehabilitation of Yegashet Charents, calling for the republication of the Armenian national writers Rafi and Patkanyan, and so on and so forth.
Okay, yes, we will talk all of these questions, but again, let's start from his young years, and he was he was member of Baku Commune, right?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was definitely a member of Baku Commune.
I'm not sure he was one of the leading figures.
He was a significant figure in the Baku Commune, very close to Stepan Shamyan, and in the years after the execution of the 26 Baku commissars, whose fate he managed to escape purely by chance, because his name was supposed to be on this list of kind of, I guess you could say, Bolsheviks, to be executed. And basically what happened was these Baku commissars were fleeing from Baku, and they went to Krasnovodsk, and they effectively, I mean, this was, now today we're talking about the town of, or the city of Turkmenbashi in Turkmenistan. And so what ended up happening is that region at the time was governed by kind of, I guess you could say, right SRs. Right socialist revolutionaries during this period of the Russian Civil War, who were aligned with the British. And the British, as we know, I mean, they were in India, and they had interests, kind of certainly in the Russian Civil War. They also intervened, as we know, in the Caucasus. In the case of, when we talk about the Artsakh issue, when we talk about Karabakh, the British also had a hand there. I'm not going to go into that right now. But in this case, the Socialist Revolutionary government that was running this area of Transcaspia, this region of Turkmenistan, they were the ones who executed the commissars, and most likely with some British connivance, actually with British connivance.
Yes,
not
because
most
I
likely.
remember years ago there were some speculations about his escape.
But it's not only him, by the way, who managed to escape this. It was also the wives of many of the Baku commissars, and also the sons of Shamian. So, like, for example, we talk about Lev Shamian, who later played a very important role in, de-Stalinization on the whole Union level, on the all-Union level. And also, we can say, he was also, of course, involved with the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. First deputy editor of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. So, again,
but having member of this Baku Commune just had an influence in his later career, right? He became just kind of part of this iconic.
Well, Mikoyan also evolves. This is really, really important for Armenians, especially to understand. His attitude toward national issues evolves. So, in this period where he's in the kind of under the influence of the Bakuvian internationalism, his view on national issues is much more internationalist. Even in his letter, he has this letter to Lenin in December 1919, where basically he advocates disavowing Western Armenia. This is a letter that actually is quite known, that has been in the discourse in part of the Armenian debates on Mikoyan. But he also has an interesting section where he says that, when we talk about nationality issues, we shouldn't be concerned with this or that border or this or that national republic. We should think about all nations of all working classes uniting together, and so on and so forth. But then, by the time we get to this period of Khrushchev, he's, praising the benefits of national statehood as realized in the Soviet Union, and certainly within the Armenian context. But even before that, we can say, when we look at his role in governing the North Caucasus, he also is a big proponent of kind of advocating, I guess you could say, national statehood, particularly with regard to Chechnya. Because Chechnya, he helps kind of establish
creator of
absolutely.
Chechnya Autonomous Republic.
Chechnya, well, actually, first it was oblast, and then it became a republic. And then it was merged with Ingushetia, and then it became the Checheno-Ingush
So Chechens should be grateful to Mikoyan,
I
right?
guess you could say that.
Do they remember about his legacy?
They do, actually, as a matter of fact, because there is, in particular, there is an interesting 2-volume compilation of materials that was published in the Russian Federation about the restoration of Checheno-Ingushetia. And it really highlights Mikoyan's role in advocating for the return and rehabilitation of the Chechens and the Ingush, which I also talk in this book, because during the war, actually, Stalin in Beria, first and foremost Beria, advocated deporting whole nationalities from the North Caucasus. And Mikoyan was actually opposed to this, at least on the official basis that it would look bad for the Soviet Union's international reputation. But the main thing is that he, later on during the thaw, was one of the first people advocating for the return of these nationalities, their rehabilitation. In all cases, it wasn't successful because, in most cases, let me just backtrack on that. In most cases, it was successful. But in certain cases, like in the case of the Crimean Tatars, or we can say, the Volga Germans, they did not succeed in coming back to their kind of pre-war places where they had been located. Because, again, there were some, many issues with regard to this. There were many debates within the Soviet leadership. That's one thing we also have to understand. In particular, in the post-war years, in the post-Stalin years, we're talking about a Soviet Union where there are many voices, many towers to the Kremlin, so to speak. And so, as a result, you have policy outcomes that are affected by these internal debates within the Soviet Union.
Yes, and coming again to another national question, in Armenia, there was a criticism that he was pro-Azerbaijani.
No, he would not
just be talking about it with conscience.
I think that, because the Armenians, they're thinking about this period where Mikoyan was effectively more internationalist than nationalist, or even you can say that later on in years, it's not...
And his criticism of Dashnak Party and...
his criticism of Dashnak Party is like the same kind of criticism you would hear from any Armenian Bolshevik or Armenian kind of socialist, that kind of a thing. He has, in chapter 4 of the book, I highlight actually his engagement with Armenian national issues and his criticisms of the Dashnak Party. And Mikoyan believed fundamentally that Armenia's future was with Russia, in particular Bolshevist Russia, in particular the Russian SFSR, in particular communist or Soviet Russia, I should say. And he actually saw the Dazhnaks as betraying the Armenian national security by kind of flirting with Western powers, by flirting with the Allies. What he would say is that they were hitching the the First Republic of Armenia to the Anglo-American chariot, and you see the result that it exposed Armenia to, exposed Armenia to genocide by the Turks. He actually openly discusses this issue of 1915 in the draft notes of his 1954 speech in Yerevan. And in his memoirs, he's even more explicit because he uses the term genocide. But what really kind of affects his mentality is that for Armenia's geopolitical salvation, for its geopolitical protection, the alliance with Russia and the association with Russia is most important. If you look at his personal writings, his memoirs, he's extremely consistent on this issue. That for Armenia's safety, for Armenia's existence, it's very, very important to have, to have that kind of association with Russia. That's something that, and actually, again, you could even say that has echoes of what we're seeing today, actually, with Armenia. But he was very, very strong on that particular, question, as a matter of fact. But also it was that he saw in Russia, he would say that this is not a question of, I guess, lesser evilism, because at the end of the day, Russia also brings us great kind of cultural benefits, intellectual benefits. By uniting with Russia, it kind of brings us with this kind of Russian revolutionary democratic movement, which gave, for example, Armenian nationalism, in his words, he would say, the right direction. So for example, when we talk about the great Armenian national revolutionary writers of the 19th century, we talk about, for example, Rafi, who he was very much influenced by Mikoyan, as a matter of fact, but also we can say Abovian, Nalbandian, all these writers. They were under the influence of kind of the Russian revolutionary and Russian radical democratic tradition. So Mikoyan would highlight that as well, that thanks, to our association with Russia, we have this association with the radical revolutionary democratic movement. We have this connection also with kind of the European intellectual movements. And it's really quite important for Armenia. So this is not somebody, actually, when you understand, by the way, Sուրեն, how deep he's engaged in these issues that are of immense importance to us when we talk about the history of Armenia, Armenian studies and all that, you realize just how Armenian he is. And that was actually one of the interesting things I found going into this project. I was thinking from the outset, when, because I was always interested first and foremost in Soviet Armenia. I was interested in this history of Soviet Armenia, which I felt had been understudied, because in today's Armenia in particular, but also in diaspora, the focus has been on issues such as the First Republic, or on the genocide, or on the Karabakh issue. And I wanted to kind of figure out more about the Soviet Armenian history.
Yes, and it's kind of this loophole, that it's just this trap that we think that there is no need to research Soviet Armenia. It's so close. We know everything about it, but it's not.
It's not so close.
We don't. Yes.
We should not assume that we know everything about it, and it's a history that surrounds us. I mean, even in certainly in the city of Yerevan, and everything you see here in Yerevan, so much of it goes back to the Soviet times, and you can't disassociate that legacy. I mean, there are some Armenians who like to think that we can just ignore this, kind of history, but you can't. It's part of Armenia's past. And so anyway, going into this, I was always interested in the Soviet Armenian history. Also, I was interested in Perestroika, the Artsakh movement. But in particular with the Mikoyan issue, I was interested in his role in de-Stalinization, in rehabilitation.
But before we come to the de-Stalinization, I think we should also discuss about his involvement in purges.
It's very important.
Yes, it's another discussion, question for discussion, because there is this famous telegram, his reports that he himself proposed, increasing the executing quota for Armenia. And how do you reconcile these two seemingly contradictory facts about his life? De-Stalinization and at the same time participation.
Well, because de-Stalinization is intimately tied in with his role in the purges. Because Mikoyan was a man who felt great guilt for his role in the repressions in the 1930s.
So it was guilt, but not just pragmatic political calculation.
No, it's not. Because actually, the other thing that's also a very big misnomer I found about Mikoyan is that there is this kind of a stereotype about him that he was like the vicar of Bray, that he had no political convictions, that he just, the way he survived is because he just, went with the wind, with whatever regime he was, there going with. But in fact, actually, when you look at, for example, his role in influencing the nationality policy reform, or his very, very strong commitment to de-Stalinization in Khrushchev's times, and he was, by the way, rather alone in this because, he was Khrushchev's strongest supporter on de-Stalinization, but there was a lot of opposition in the 50s to de-Stalinization from people like Melenkov, Kaganovich, Molotov. Eventually they were defeated. We talk about the anti-party group issue. But this was not a universally accepted, kind of pathway to take. I mean, even you had, of course, famously Soslov, who was opposed to this kind of, de-Stalinization. We talk about kind of the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and he's like criticizing that, Snegov and Shatanovskaya, who were basically two Gulag survivors who advised Mikoyan and Khrushchev on de-Stalinization. So we had actually Gulag survivors who came back, who advised Mikoyan and Khrushchev in 1954, the same year, by the way, where he gave this Yerevan speech in March. But you had these former returnees, these former Gulag inmates who came back and personally advised them. Shatanovskaya, by the way, was involved with the Baku Commune. She was the secretary of Shamyan in Baku. So there is this. So there is this whole kind of past that's all,
so the guilt of Mikoyan. Guilt of what? How he considered?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that his role. I don't want to spoil it for everybody, because if you read the first chapter of the book, I go more in depth than anybody else on his role in the Stalinist repressions. Incredible depth.
Some people love reading books after spoilers.
Yes. So, but this chapter in particular, when you look at when we talk about the repressions in Armenia, there are some scientists in Armenia who try to divide up. They think about Soviet repressions. So they talk about repressions maybe in 20s, at the time of Sovietization, then collectivization, then the Stalinist purges. But it's important to look at the Stalinist purges in Armenia and to look at the way in which those occurred in phases. So the first phase was this phase of Amatuni and Khachik Mogdusi. So after Beria shoots Agassi Khanjian in 1936, and he does, because there was a very thorough investigation during the thaw about this, and they find that Beria most likely did. The evidence was pointing to the fact that he did shoot Agassi Khanjian in his office. Right? There was even famously discussions. If we look at Stephen Kokin's massive studies of Stalin, he even was, kind of touching on this issue, and he was saying, well, how can we say that Beria, shot Khanjian when there was a party control committee in the next room? They surely would have heard a gunshot. Well, it shows me Kotkin has not read the rehabilitation report of Agassi Khanjian, which is a very, very thorough rehabilitation report, which, unfortunately, Agassi Khanjian's case is not here in Yerevan, in fund in the 1191, which is the repressed persons fund. It's most likely in Moscow, but we can say, based on the materials that we have here in Yerevan and also what we have in Moscow that's been published in archival editions, because there are like these zborniki that have collected archival documents, that they show this was a very thorough investigation. But Kotkin apparently didn't read this because the one surviving member of the party control committee, Ivanova, later testified in 50s. She testified in the 50s in this 50s investigation that in fact they did hear a gunshot in this room, and that the head of the committee actually went to go investigate, and then he came back and said that Beria shot Khanjian, and that he saw it, and that not only did he see it, on the train back to Moscow, he drew a sketch with Khanjian's dead body on the floor, and Ivanova saw the sketch, and she was repulsed by it. She was like afraid, with what she saw. She was horrified by it, and she destroyed the sketch. But this is, and that's just one piece of evidence from this case, by the way. But the main thing is, number one, that Khandjian was, we have to think of it like this. He was basically, him and his whole network in Armenia, which included the leading writers of Armenia of that time, Charents, Bakuns, Totovens, people like this, yeah. They were opposing Beria and his claim to monopoly of power in the Caucasus, and especially his book on the history of the Bolsheviks of Transcaucasia. And actually, as a matter of fact, Nersik Stepanyan was the most vocal opponent of this book. Anyway, so once Khandjian is out of the way, then Beria goes, full steam ahead and launches a complete purge in Armenia with his, allies, Amatuni and Khachik Mogdusi. Well, then what happens is Amatuni and Mogdusi, maybe we can say, overstep their bounds when they arrest. And, really, it's not them, really, because he's arrested in Moscow. He's not arrested in Yerevan. Sakhtar Gabrielyan is arrested in Moscow, and then he's transferred to Yerevan, And in Yerevan, he is interrogated by the Armenian NKVD under Mogdusi's direction, and then he is kind of, basically, he either jumps from or falls from the third-floor window of the NKVD building in Yerevan, or what is today the National Security Building in Yerevan. And this, what happens is then Stalin is angered by this because nobody has informed Stalin. So then a second phase of the repressions in Armenia occurs when Stalin sends to Yerevan, according to his own letter, by the way, if you look at his original letter, a copy of which is in Garf, in the Russian State Archive. There is also apparently a copy in Yerevan, but I wasn't able to find in the Armenian archives. But where Stalin explicitly says that I'm going to send Melenkov for an on-site investigation. No Mikoyan. He just says Melenkov, right? This is actually quite important because Mikoyan does not arrive till much later, actually, in this intervention. So this September intervention, we're talking about from September 14th all the way to maybe October 20th, 1937. This is the second phase in which basically what happens is the NKVD of Armenia, the power of it is suspended, and an NKVD brigade from Moscow comes in and runs the Armenian internal affairs during this period. So this is Mikhail Litvin and his brigade of 5 men basically come in, and they run the Armenian internal affairs from this period from September 14th to October 20th. And Mikoyan is sent there basically about a week later. From the time that Melenkov arrives, actually, you have to think in Yerevan with a whole entourage. It's him, it's Litvin and the brigade, and it's also Melenkov's personal assistant, Dmitry Sukhanov, and also some others too, like this Donskoy, his ally Donskoy, and also this editor of this magazine, Party Construction, effectively. And so they all, join him, in Yerevan, and they stop, actually, before they arrive in Yerevan, they stop in Tiflis, and they discuss the whole issue with Beria first, and they seek his advice. But Mikoyan does not arrive in Armenia until September 20th, 1937, which is an incredibly important date, because what happens on September 20th, 1918? We just talked about at the start of this podcast. What happens?
Khandjian?
No, 1918, Sուրեն, 1918, not 1936. That would have been July 1936 that Khandjian was, assassinated.
1918?
1918. We just talked about the start of the podcast.
And what was the date? Remind me.
We're talking September 20th, 1918.
September 20th, 1918, Baku Commune?
Yes. Perfect. Absolutely. Baku Commune. And this is the assassination of the 26 Baku Commissars, the execution of the 26 Baku Commissars. So Stalin is sending a message to Mikoyan, you follow my will or else. And so we have actually the documentary materials that originated from the FSB archives, where Stalin sends Mikoyan to Yerevan on this date. And these materials actually were Xeroxed. I received copies from them from the Society Memorial in Moscow, by the way. So I also was working with Memorial in composing this chapter of the book. So anyway, he arrives to Yerevan, and that's it's in this period where we have this request for an increase in repressions, although the original request was not by Mikoyan. It was a request that was advanced to Yezhov and Stalin by Mikoyan, Melenkov, and Litvin. And Mikoyan, also we have to understand in this period of Soviet history, but also throughout Soviet history, was always opposed to violent solutions to problems. And what I actually believe, and actually what the evidence seems to be pointing to, is that this was more likely, this proposal, this initiative came from Melenkov and Litvin, but that Mikoyan, as the most senior party official, had to send the proposal to Moscow, but he didn't want to send the proposal alone. And he wanted to kind of, for historical posterity, show that actually it came from them. So all three of these men signed it. Because you have to think that when Litvin and Melenkov arrived in Yerevan, the number of Category 1 repressions increased significantly, because basically Ahmatuni proposed to Stalin in 1937, July 1937, that Category 1 repressions in Armenia, which is immediate arrest and execution. This would be about 500 people, right? And effectively, when Melenkov and Litvin arrived in Yerevan, and Melenkov arrived, basically he didn't do his business when he arrived in Yerevan. He didn't conduct his business out of the Central Committee building of Armenia. We have to understand. He ran everything out of the NKVD building in Armenia, right? This was a very, very heavy-handed repression. Many in Armenia were hoping, and this was from the testimonies not only in 1957, when Melenkov is on the hot seat, shall we say, with the anti-party group issue, but even in the early 50s, when we look at testimonies from Armenians from 1191, where in the early 50s you have people saying, yes, we hoped that when the representatives of the Central Committee in Moscow came here, that they would understand what Ahmatuni and Mogdusi had done, and they would be so open to revealing the real abuses of the leadership. Well, instead what we got was a repression of old Bolsheviks. And that the cellars of the NKVD building in Yerevan were filled with party workers. That people were sent there almost every night. It was a terrible situation. And so what you ended up having was, during that period, the intervention period alone, Sուրեն, we're talking September 14th, 1937 to October 20th, 1937, alone in that period, there were 500 Category 1 repressions. So what really happened was, when Melenkov and Litvin arrived in Yerevan, the number of repressions had actually, they had exceeded the quota that Ahmatuni had established way back in July. And they understood we need to, request to Moscow that we have to increase the quota. So
it was kind of retroactive.
Yes, and Mikoyan came in as the most senior leader, and he was the one who was given the responsibility. You have to send this request to Moscow. Mikoyan probably didn't want to send it on his own initiative, so he said, okay, for posterity, you guys, also sign this. That's why those, requests for about Category 1, Category 2 repressions.
Yeah, but in people perception, being Armenian just made it more frightening. If you just,
absolutely, and that's why actually it really informs Mikoyan's guilt, because he's in his own country.
Yeah,
we're talking. This is about, we can say, 20 years after the genocide of 1915. So which is actually something that really influences Mikoyan's thinking. So it does impact his guilt on this issue. Mikoyan's main task in this intervention, by the way, was to change the leadership of Armenia, really to kind of help with kind of this, I guess you could say, post-Ahmatuni leadership adjustment. It was Beria who proposed First Secretary Grigori Arutinov become the First Secretary of Armenia. But Mikoyan had proposed several other people to fill in additional positions there. And actually, we can say that those individuals who he proposed were arrested by the end of the year. So that tells you about the nature of these repressions in Armenia in 1937. And really, the third phase of the repressions in Armenia, kind of going all the way back to when I'm talking about these three phases, the third phase is in the early part of the Arutinov era, where it's just after the Yerevan intervention from October 1937 all the way to, I want to say maybe early 1939. Where you have a new head of the NKVD in Armenia, and after that point, then basically kind of this whole period of the Great Terror, or the Great Purge, I should say, because again, even scientists are debating this idea: is it appropriate to say Great Terror or Great Purge, and that kind of a thing? I want to set aside the historiographical issue.
It's not.
But anyway, the bottom line is that my research on this topic is extraordinarily it's extraordinarily detailed. And what was amazing to me going into this topic is, as much as we talk about repressions in Armenia, and we have people who study today memory politics of Stalinist repressions in Armenia, that nobody had done a really good political history of the Stalinist repressions, and that nobody really knew about these specific details regarding this intervention of 1937. And now we have the information on that. So this chapter was incredibly important for me to kind of set the stage, but not only, because it's the materials I found with relation to, in regard to repressions, also referred to rehabilitations and de-Stalinization. So 1191 is a treasure trove of materials in the Armenian archives for not only understanding the political course of the Stalinist repressions, but also the political course of rehabilitations, de-Stalinization, and these kind of questions, which are really significant for Armenia much later on.
Yeah,
but,
and so
yeah.
Also
something else I want to add is how Stalin, in this 37 intervention, was watching everything very closely from Moscow. So of course we have these narratives, even in Armenia, where many people say, well, you know, Stalin wasn't aware of repressions, or he didn't know, or something. We know that he knew because he was, in this specific period, talking every day to Malenkov, asking him what's going on the ground. And it's also quite interesting because that also tells you that Malenkov, in Stalin's point of view, was seen as his eyes and ears, that he didn't really trust Mikoyan enough to be constantly in communication with Mikoyan on these issues. He was more in touch with Malenkov, asking, you know, what's happening, what's going on, what do you need, you know. For example, Amatuni, so Malenkov's initial, aim when he arrived in Yerevan was to arrest Mokdusi and Gulyan. He wanted to arrest that Stalin said you have to arrest these specific leaders from the Armenian Communist Party. But Amatuni, Stalin said, well, we don't have enough evidence on him just yet, but we need you maybe to find evidence on him, right? We know that that Molotov and I, we know that Amatuni is a hidden Trotskyite. So we want you to find the evidence on Amatuni, right? And what ended up happening is actually it was the testimony of Ashot Hovhannisyan, who was the former First Secretary of Armenia in the 20s in the NEP period, and then also later the very, very famous Armenian historian, Soviet Armenian historian, who actually came forth with incriminating evidence against Amatuni. That Amatuni confessed to him his secret orientation toward Trotskyism and specificism, right? This kind of a thing. Specificism is another whole issue, which we could get into in this podcast. But that's where that evidence comes from about Amatuni, that they use this testimony of Ashot Hovhannisyan to kind of, advance that, point. Although it didn't really help Hovhannisyan, who remained a victim himself of repressions, by the way. So that's kind of the whole history.
Yeah,
and also,
but anyway, he felt he had this genuine sense of guilt.
Not only that, also this was, when I mentioned about Stalin's role, when I mentioned that, it's very important to highlight how even the local Republican autonomy in this case, or self-governance of the Soviet Armenia, of the Soviet Armenian Republic, was brushed out the door, because it was so centralized, this intervention, that you have to think the all-union NKVD from Moscow is running the Armenian Internal Affairs Commissariat for a period of about a month. The basically the Malenkov, and you have Mikoyan, central leaders from the central government who are coming in. Malenkov is updating Stalin constantly about what's going on. Stalin's watching what's going on. There was a reporter, Kotlyarov, who was reporting on Armenian affairs in 1937, and Amatuni complained to Stalin that he's not reporting the right picture. And who did Stalin send from Pravda to cover the intervention? Kotlyarov. And Stalin personally made these choices. He personally supervised this whole intervention. So what I'm saying is that this showed how highly centralized the state was in this period of time. And this also created a kind of a lasting legacy for Mikoyan, in the sense that Mikoyan understood that he doesn't want that the union itself, that under Stalin, the local self-governance of the republics had been severely curtailed and severely reduced. It was seen as kind of an illustration of this. So any kind of self-governance vis-a-vis Moscow, he would argue in the 50s, had to be enhanced, because under Stalin, this local self-governance had been severely curtailed, and this Armenian intervention of 1937 would have been it was actually, to him, a prime example of this.
Okay.
So that kind of lays it all out there.
Yeah. And now coming to this de-Stalinization project and his pivotal role in this dismantling and rejecting the repressive Stalin's legacy. So let's start from here. The next part of our podcast. So how much he was involved in this process? You said that he is the leading figure under this process, and who were involved, and I want just to detail this.
He was extremely deeply involved in this process, and actually, what's interesting is that in the historiography of the Soviet Union in Russia and also in the West, his role in de-Stalinization was fairly well known. Right. So if you look at these historians, for example, like. There was a book published recently from Harvard University Press, actually not recently, more like about 10 years ago, by Kathleen Smith called Moscow 1956, right? Or you have Stephen F. Cohen's book, The Victim's Return. Or you have, I don't know, the book by Nancy Adler, you know, about kind of the return of the Gulag victims. Actually, she did 2 books on this subject. But they are all talking about the role of Mikoyan in this process. And how Mikoyan knew personally these individuals who became known as kind of Khrushchev's zeks, you know, the former, or zeki, the former from zakluchony, the idea of former political prisoners who advised Khrushchev on de-Stalinization. So that was fairly well known, but what was known, especially in the Armenian, you know, in terms of the Armenian historiography, both in the West and also even in Armenia. So it's not only the case of, like, for example, Mary Matosyan's book, The Impact of Soviet Policies in Armenia, but also Amatuni Virabyan's book, where about post-war Soviet Armenia, where they talk about the speech Mikoyan gives in 1954, calling for the rehabilitation of Charents.
Okay,
my point is with all this is that these two narratives, that this whole history was, on one level you had the all-Union perspective of Mikoyan's role in de-Stalinization, and then this kind of Armenian view of it. But nobody ever put it all together.
I wanted to clarify to our just listeners that Mikoyan in 1954 made a landmark visit to Yerevan, and he delivered a speech, and he rehabilitated some national writers and figures, Charents, Andranik, right?
No, Andranik comes much later on, although he did participate in his rehabilitation, by the way, even though this was very much contested in the Soviet times, because Azerbaijani writers, there were some Azerbaijanis who were against, you know, kind of this idea of rehabilitating Andranik. But if you look at, you know, the how do I say this? If you look at Mikoyan's, the Soviet era edition of his memoirs, he highlights that, you know, Andranik, he at one point pledged his allegiance to the Baku Commune. He gave his, you know, saber to the National History Museum of Armenia, that kind of a thing. So Mikoyan, together with also Marshal Bagramian, were participating in this effort by the Soviet Armenian government in the 60s to kind of rehabilitate or do a rehabilitation of Andranik, but that wasn't in the speech yet.
Yes.
That's much later on.
Getting back to 1954 speech, just can you describe the speech?
Well, first of all,
what it was about, and the wording of Mikoyan.
So first of all, number one, when we talk about that he rehabilitated Charents with the one speech, it's not entirely correct, because he called for his rehabilitation. That's why I say he called for his rehabilitation. But the process of rehabilitation of Charents did not really conclude until May 25th, 1955. This was March 11th, 1954, that this occurs. But if you look at the rehabilitation materials of Axel Bakuns, they say that Charents was already rehabilitated on March 11th, 1954 in Mikoyan's speech. So even in the official documents, there's kind of some conflict. Was Charents rehabilitated on March 11th, 1954, or was he? Can we say he was rehabilitated on May 25th, 1955? It's an interesting kind of historiographical question. But anyway, the point is that Mikoyan came to Yerevan, and he basically said that, you know, we quite rightly oppose national chauvinism, but we should also oppose with equal force national nihilism. And that really, at the end of the day, we should not be indifferent or insensitive to national cultures. And that, you know, the former Soviet Armenian authorities were very insensitive toward the, you know, historical heritage of Rafi, the author, of course, as we know, the famous Armenian author Rafi, and also Raphael Patkanyan, that it came to a point where even Patkanyan's statue was removed in Echmiadzin. He was saying this in his speech, and also to restore the great memory of Alexander Myasnikan, who had been kind of almost airbrushed out, quietly, of the kind of official Soviet historiography. And finally, most importantly of all, he calls for Charents to be rehabilitated. And in that speech, the audio of that speech, which we have from the Armenian archives, once he mentions the name Charents, the room explodes in applause for about 30 to 35 seconds. And we also have, again, the great memoirs of Regina Gazarian, who was Charents' friend, the artist, and she said, at that moment when she heard that speech, I guess this was on the radio, she was like so inspired that she went out in a half delirium, this is her own words from the Armenian text, to exhume these manuscripts of Charents that she had buried in the ground. We're talking about 17 years earlier. So this is also something that even in this case, it's a speech that has an impact really in almost kind of this kind of revival of Charents. And not only that, even if you go to the Charents House Museum on Mashtots Avenue, there's a painting by Gazarian where she shows how there's 1937, the year of repression, and 1954 as the year of release, when she releases the manuscripts from the ground. Not 1956, not Khrushchev's speech when he denounces Stalin. This is 2 years before Khrushchev denounces Stalin. In this period of what the historian Nancy Adler calls the so-called silent de-Stalinization, the kind of before Stalin is officially condemned, kind of quiet steps toward gradually removing Stalin from the scene, even a nationality policy in the speech. Mikoyan, he hardly mentions Stalin. He focuses more his attention on the Leninist nationality policy, on Lenin's contribution. So again, it's moving the needle away from Stalin and toward Lenin. It's kind of the idea of re-Leninization of the party and the Soviet system, and that's really kind of the idea he advances in Yerevan in 1954, and that we should be more sensitive to the concerns of nationalities and national cultures.
Yes, and his plans for decentralization of Soviet Union.
But what's most interesting is
granting republics more autonomy.
But what's most interesting, Sուրեն, is what happens. So we talk about March 11th, 1954. He gives a speech in Yerevan. But what's less known until my book was that 1 week later, on March 18th, 1954, he establishes a review commission. Actually, well, I shouldn't say he establishes it, but there's a review commission in his name that's established in Soviet Armenia with the Republic's leading officials on the commission. Suren Tovmasyan, who was first secretary at the time, Anton Kochinyan, Yakov Zorobyan, all the big names, from this period of the Soviet Armenian history. And it was a period it was a commission in the name of Mikoyan that was tasked with investigating appeals directed to Mikoyan relating to rehabilitations. Most of them were relating to rehabilitations. There were some that were also about improvements in the city of Yerevan and all this. That's a whole other issue. Mikoyan's role in advising Armenian leaders on improvements in the Soviet Armenian Republic and on kind of assisting Armenian leaders on major, economic projects in Soviet Armenia, like the Arpa-Sivan tunnel, we can say. But anyway, in this period of time, this commission is created, and we have evidence, actually, this commission, we have archival evidence here in Yerevan about the creation of this commission. But in Moscow, in Garf, in the State Archive, we also have Mikoyan's communications with Kochinyan about the work of this commission and how thoroughly he was involved with the work of this commission. He was personally invested in all these rehabilitation cases. He signs off personally on each case. And he had also, you have to think, he had been receiving rehabilitation requests from the time of Lavrenti Beria's arrest and execution in 1953, as early, we can even say, as like from the time of Beria's arrest, because we already have, here in the Armenian archives, we have the evidence of Ler Khamsar, that Ler Khamsar actually, he basically sent an appeal to Mikoyan for his rehabilitation. Mikoyan forwarded the appeal to Aratinov at the time, who was still first secretary, and eventually, Ler Komsar was, as we know, rehabilitated. But there's even a whole diela on that here in Yerevan. But Mikoyan had been receiving these requests, and he felt that if I give this speech in Yerevan, it would send a signal to those appealing to me that the state is open to rehabilitations. It's open that we are open to reviewing the cases. And sure enough, after he gave the speech, the number of appeals he received mushroomed. And that's why this commission was created, to help him deal with these appeals. And really, it was done with the deep involvement of the Soviet Armenian state. So both him and the Soviet Armenian authorities were working together on this whole process of de-Stalinization, which also brings us to something else, which is this new trend in Western scholarship of, I guess you could say, decentering Soviet history from just the Moscow perspective, where we're looking at how Soviet history is unfolding in different parts of the Soviet Union, how different parts of the USSR impact the overall Soviet history, how Armenia, Sուրեն, impacted the whole all-union process of de-Stalinization through Mikoyan and his speech. That's when we talk about Mikoyan's legacy. It's not just, I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, yes,
I never thought it from this angle. Yeah.
Well, because, and that was actually quite striking to me, that 10 years ago when they had this great debate about Mikoyan in Armenia, nobody was talking about his role in de-Stalinization. His opponents were talking about his role in Stalinist repressions. His supporters were talking about his role in international diplomacy, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But nobody talked about his role in de-Stalinization, which for me is quite important, because that 54 speech, not only does it initiate this whole process of de-Stalinization in Armenia, really earlier than other parts of the Soviet Union. You know, I mean, really kind of the Armenian thought begins earlier than, let's say, maybe you can say the Ukrainian thought, or even, various other parts, maybe in Central Asia or whatever. But that this process for Armenia begins earlier because of this speech. That for Armenians, this period of Zinhal begins really in 1954, not 1956. And that also brings us to the events of 1965, because you can't have the 1965 genocide demonstrations in Yerevan without 1954 Mikoyan's speech. And you can't have, certainly you wouldn't be able to have the Artsakh movement of 1988. That this speech in 54 and this Zinhal made possible 1965 and 1988 in Armenia. So in the Armenian historiography, this speech has not been well investigated, but partly because so much of the archival materials on Mikoyan are all in Moscow. There are whole diela in Moscow, in Ergaspi, in Garf, in Mikoyan's personal files, whole diela, Sուրեն, that are entirely in the Armenian language. Right? Yeah. You even would have diela that they were just simply, it was just simply called.
It is not common for that time.
Yeah, but and you even have
you
even have diela that are in like in Ergaspi where it's just simply called Na Armyanskum. And they didn't know what it was, and I knew what it was because I could read, what this was exactly. Yeah. But there's this whole kind of, I guess you could say, secret history of Soviet Armenia that's not well known here, because it's mostly in Moscow. Yeah. And this book, for the first time, marries the history we have there with the materials we have here, with materials we have from, the Armenian party papers, even local party papers. For instance, the local party newspaper of Mekri, or Kajaran, or whatever. This is also a history, especially when you look at his role in advising Armenian leaders on development projects in Armenia. It's a history of the Armenian regions, where you go there today if you're from the diaspora or for a tourist, a Western tourist going to Armenia, and you see these towns where, people once had jobs, they once had opportunity, and now you have like depressed economy in these places. That the history, if you want to know the history of these towns when they were at their zenith, when they were at their height, you look at this book, because they talk all about the history of, for example, Gapan or Alaverdi or I don't know, Kirovakan. Yeah,
Arzani,
absolutely. When they were at their height, and the way in which Moscow, in the figure of Mikoyan, assisted Armenia through this. And actually, it's interesting because even though we have some Armenians who, for some reason, they say Mikoyan was pro-Azerbaijani, the Azerbaijanis actually don't like Mikoyan at all. Yeah. Because they believe he was this kind of lobbyist for Armenia, And it's not entirely incorrect to say this. Of course, again, in the Azerbaijani context, this is exaggerated. It's kind of done with this very strongly anti-Armenian slant, with this intention of trying to show the whole Soviet system was rigged against us and da-da-da. Never mind that the Soviet system benefited Azerbaijanis, because look at Haydar Aliyev, for example. But still, Mikoyan was a lobbyist for Armenia. And the evidence is not just me saying this without any evidence, Sուրեն.
Yeah.
The evidence is overwhelming. It's like a whole mountain of evidence. It can't be denied. It's like it's almost. I mean, it's just incredible how much evidence there is about this. That's why, even like I said, I was surprised myself to find how involved he was. I mean, we even have a documentary from 1962 from the Armenian archives about Mikoyan in Armenia. Mikoyan in Hayastan, and basically this shows his visits to the regions, but behind those kind of official, behind that kind of official coverage that you would see in the newsreels, or you would see in the film, or you would read about in Sovetika and Hayastan, there was a context where Mikoyan was advising the Armenian leaders about a certain project, about helping them gain resources for this project, and all this and that. And they would periodically.
Yes, in Armenia, we know Mikoyan, and it's very two big extremes. The first is a central figure during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and also the second, we know him as the father of the Soviet food industry,
which is very important too.
Yes.
So, for instance, like today, we have.
Who suggested Doktorskaya sausage?
Yes, not only that, also pakpahak. Yes, pakpahak. So, for instance, we have a very famous ice cream here in Armenia today, which is called in 1930s.
Visit to the United States
in 1936. In 1936, but also if you look at something like here in Armenia, we have our very famous, SSSR ice cream.
Yeah,
and this ice cream is exactly the legacy of Mikoyan, right? And he, that's a huge thing that people don't realize, because that's something that touched everybody. I mean, you go to Russia. I lived in Russia for 3 years in St. Petersburg, and first, everybody knows about the anecdote about. From Ilyich to Ilyich without heart attack and paralysis, but there's also this whole narrative of, this whole thing with the Soviet food industry. It was immensely important. I don't cover it in this book because I'm more focused on the thaw. I'm more focused on Khrushchev's period. But that's a highly significant episode if we're talking about the life of Mikoyan. But Mikoyan, we can say too, was very sensitive to Armenian national issues, in particular toward the period of the thaw, toward the 50s. He abandons this kind of internationalism because you have to think, in his youth, he's basically an Armenian nationalist. In the mold of kind of Rafi and these kind of writers. Rafi has the enormous impact on him. But then, like I said, he becomes internationalist, and then he becomes, like, I would say, a national communist. I hesitate to say he's nationalist because he doesn't dislodge communist or Soviet ideology from Armenian identity. He's very much, again, what Mike Lehman would call, I guess, he's a manifestation of what Mike Lehman would call apricot socialism, a figure who embodied both what was Soviet and socialist and Armenian at the same time. Yeah,
it's coming to the last debates and his legacy. And Mikoyan was one of these few who survived politically from Lenin to Brezhnev.
Yes, as we know.
Right,
yeah,
and yes, and the anecdote you just shared. And in your opinion, what personal qualities, such as flexibility or intelligence or pragmatism, contributed to his political longevity?
It was flexibility and pragmatism, but we also should not discount his own political convictions. And actually, it was part of that. So even though we say yes, he survived and all this, and he thought, like, for instance, he could influence Stalin on certain issues, and in reality, toward the very end, he was almost purged by Stalin because he actually had deviated from Stalin on certain issues in the late Stalinist period. But when we talk about he was kind of on the brinks of the danger. Yeah, of being, absolutely. And somehow he always misses it just by, I guess you could say, a hair. But in the case of the period of Brezhnev, in the case of the period of Khrushchev, when you talk about the downfall of Khrushchev, Mikoyan was the one party official who still supported him. And he supported him because there was this conviction Mikoyan had that the process of de-Stalinization was so important, that we had to continue it, and that if new people come, if a new kind of crop of party leaders come in, and we don't know where that process is going to go, Mikoyan was not one of these figures who was against Khrushchev. He was still loyal to Khrushchev till the very end. And actually, that's why actually Brezhnev and company did not really fully trust him. And actually, Mikoyan himself got tired of Brezhnev and company. So Mikoyan actually resigned in 1965, which is only 1 year after, you know, Khrushchev was overthrown. So Mikoyan didn't even stay that long under Brezhnev. It was just that he was there for 1 year. And even then, he couldn't do anything. The Brezhnev people, the new Brezhnev group, didn't allow him to really do anything, you know, and he wanted to do much more, in particular, even in this later period of his career. But instead, what he did was he retired, he focused on writing his memoirs, and that was kind of pretty much that. But I also want to highlight again this effort of the, really quick if I may, discuss this, because I know even though we're limited on time, the two important issues, which is number one, this Karabakh situation with regard to Mikoyan. Because your listeners, being an Armenian audience, would be very interested to know what was his position on the Artsakh issue or in Karabakh. And then the second issue is, of course, this issue of the constitutional reform. So if I may talk about that, if there's enough time, I would like to touch on that, because I don't want you to get any heat for not questioning me about the Artsakh issue and Mikoyan, because that's really quite important. So then we have to talk about that.
Okay,
so this Artsakh issue, actually, Mikoyan was not involved with determining the fate of Artsakh Nagorno-Karabakh. He did not take part in the famed, in the decisive vote of July 1921. He did not have any say in that or any role in that at all. He was in Nizhny Novgorod by this time this was happening. And so he was not involved in that initial decision, although during this period of the Civil War, he was saying, you know, he actually had this one note to Lenin where he was basically saying that, you know, the Karabakh Armenians at the 5th Congress of Karabakh Armenians, you know, want to join kind of a multi-ethnic Soviet Azerbaijan. But of course, we don't know where he got that information from, and of course that information is incorrect, because the 5th Congress of Karabakh Armenians actually said quite the opposite. They said that, really, we don't want to be part of any Azerbaijan, any Azerbaijani entity. So not even a Soviet Azerbaijan, right? So no, I don't know, it's not clear from where Mikoyan got that information from, where he says that, you know, yes, these Karabakh Armenians in this Congress, they wanted to be part of Azerbaijan. There's no evidence of that at all. But what happened was, toward the later part of his career, it was very clear that the Karabakh Armenians felt a sense of discrimination. That official Baku was curbing their autonomy and their rights, although even from the start we can say that the implementation of the autonomy was also quite delayed, because it actually took the Soviet Armenian government to kind of, you know, pressure Azerbaijan to implement any autonomy for Karabakh, for Artsakh, because they were dragging their feet on even doing that, the Azerbaijani leadership, right? This is much older history, but in any case. So by the time of the Khrushchev era, Mikoyan would constantly support, when these Karabakh Armenian appeals would come up, actually he supported the Soviet Armenian government when they raised these questions with Moscow. But the problem was always that Baku would intervene and would veto this proposal to unify Karabakh with Armenia. And this was also, maybe we can say, a problem with kind of the structure of the Soviet ethno-federal state. You know, because again, autonomous oblasts in particular did not have the authority really to, you know, lift themselves out of this political situation. So on February 20th, 1988, when the Armenians of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast vote to leave Soviet Azerbaijan, we have to understand that as a major act of defiance, because there was no explicit law that said they could do that. In the constitutional reforms, where Mikoyan is the head of the nationality subcommittee, because after he does this whole idea that we should have splizhenia and not sliania, we should not merge the nations, because Khrushchev had this idea in a utopian way, we can realize communism all in one go, that that we're all going to merge together, and that it should be the party's task to help that merger. Mikoyan said, no, it shouldn't be a party task. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be respecting our differences, and eventually, yes, you know, we'll all come together, and that sort of a thing. So in the end, Mikoyan's positions were all adopted in the party program, and when Khrushchev began this major reform for a new Soviet constitution that would give power to the Soviet people, we're talking about a constitution, Sūren, that would have democratized effectively the Soviet system, that would have given Soviet citizens the right to influence the political process in a really, really direct way. It was a radical constitution that was never implemented, actually, because, Khrushchev was, ousted from power. But in the nationality subcommittee that Mikoyan headed, there were discussions about maybe we should elevate all autonomous oblasts to autonomous republics, which would give the Artsakh Armenians a greater avenue to advocate for their rights. And also, there was even this idea, maybe we should give autonomous republics the right to change the larger entity to which they're subordinated, to change the Union Republic to which they're subordinated. So even they were talking about this. It's also quite interesting when we talk about the appeal to Khrushchev of 1962 by the Karabakh Armenians, which is very famous. The original Russian edition of that letter, because we know the Armenian translation of it, which it was published in Spyork in the Armenian Diasporan Press in 1963. But in 1962, the original letter, which is here in the Armenian archives, there's like a handwritten note that we have in the diela that precedes that letter. And the handwritten note, which is written in Armenian, explicitly ties in these sentiments of the Karabakh Armenians with the constitutional reform initiative. So that also gives you the context in which this appeal is coming to Khrushchev, and that we want to have the right, as the Karabakh Armenians, to determine our future, the democratic right. If we're talking about democratization in the Soviet Union, this idea of narodovlasti, then give us the right to change the republic to which we're subordinated. And Mikoyan thought this was a very interesting idea. He was very supportive of this idea. And he was aware, by the way, of this discrimination going on with Karabakh Armenians, because you had Soviet Armenian officials like Yegashe Asatryan, who would advise Mikoyan on what was going on. And he was actually, Asatryan was from Karabakh. He was from Artsakh. He was from Chatar village. And he would tell Mikoyan would ask, what's life like in Karabakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and he would tell him, it's almost like that the opportunities there for young people are very limited, and it's almost like as if Baku is trying to push us out of Nagorno-Karabakh, just like they did with the Armenians of Nakhichevan. And then later on, Mikoyan, according to his son Sergo, at his dacha, berated an Azerbaijani official over this treatment of Karabakh Armenians. And he said that, if Baku is trying to push Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh, just like in Nakhichevan. So he was actually echoing what he was hearing from Soviet Armenian officials. Right? And this was actually quite extraordinary too, because this information comes from an unpublished memoir of Sergo that was only published in an Armenian translation in 2007 here in Yerevan, but the original Russian text I have from Sergo's son Vladimir in Moscow, as a matter of fact. But Mikoyan really was upset because he was championing always, I guess you could say, championing this idea of Druzhba Narodov, the idea of a friendship of peoples, right? And what was happening here in Karabakh was a major violation of those principles of Druzhba Narodov, of the idea of kind of friendship and opposition to national chauvinism and all this, that it was seen as a major violation of that. So he was more and more sympathetic to the Karabakh Armenian demands as he grew older. But he was very limited in what he could actually do, because always Baku was vetoing it, and usually they would have, in the case of Baku, they would have the support of hardliners in the Kremlin, like Suslov. Because Suslov did not want dramatic changes in the Soviet Union, this kind of a thing. So they would appeal to him to prevent, Karabakh or Nagorno-Karabakh from unifying with Armenia, let's say. I mean, they would seek his assistance in bolstering their veto, because they had that veto. Unlike Crimea, where the Russian SFSR, freely agreed with Soviet Ukraine to transfer Crimea to Ukraine, by the way. So yes, I mean, but that's kind of the whole thing in a nutshell. And the reforms that Mikoyan and Khrushchev, like I said, our listeners can read about this in the 6th chapter of the book. It's a groundbreaking chapter for really the whole of Soviet history, because it shows us that there was this major alternative. Had this constitution been realized in 1964, we might be living in a different world today. That's how dramatic this was. I mean, it could have prevented even, we could say, the dissolution of the Union State potentially. I mean, if it was realized. But it's a fascinating history which has been understudied, under-researched. It's been very much unknown, and it shows us that just as we think we've studied everything and we know everything, there's a lot more to learn. Okay. So I hope that kind of answers some things.
Yeah, Pietro, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today, and thank you very much for sharing all these insights and this in such a complex and significant way. And also I want just to recommend my listeners. You cannot find this book in Armenian, unfortunately.
Not yet. There's an Armenian translation coming out from New Mag Publishers.
Okay, but if you want to have it quicker, you can maybe order it through Amazon or other platforms.
Absolutely.
Yes, and read this book and maybe change your perceptions of Anastас Mikoyan.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my last question, my traditional question, today, unfortunately, social sciences and humanities are underestimated in Armenia, or maybe not only in Armenia. I think it's a global process. And my question is, what do you think? Why study humanities? Why should we be involved in social studies? This is the first question. And the second question, more personal. Why you personally decided not to be chemist or mathematician? Why you decided this this field of being historian?
Well, first, to answer the first question, I mean, I don't want to be cliche in saying that those who read history or study history will not repeat it, or that if we learn from the past, then because
I'm not sure that it works so simple.
I don't know it works so simple because again, we have, like, for example, this whole history of the First Republic, which, as we know, is studied very, very intensely and closely in Armenia, and yet there were a lot of lessons from the First Republic that, let me just say, are not being learned in Armenia today. And I'm not going to go into details. I'm not going to go into specifics on that. And we're both smiling because we kind of know some of the background of that, but I'm not going to go into details on that. But the main thing is that you do learn, if you study history well and you learn the right lessons from history, you will not repeat those same mistakes. But, what can you say? I mean, I think that in the end, though, history, it tells us a lot about our past. It helps us understand more about our present, our future even. So for young people, they should know more about the history. They should learn it. Yeah. Probably Armenia is one of the most history-obsessed nations in the world. Yeah. And that's actually, it's not a bad thing by any means. It's a very good thing. But there's a lot more to discover, as my book actually shows.
If you compare with Americans, you think Americans
they're less interested. They're less interested in history than Armenians are. Armenians are really interested in history, and history from all periods. Again, because Armenia is that old, so history going all the way back to Nairi tribes and Urartu and all that. I mean, history is around us everywhere we go, even here in Yerevan. So. Yeah, absolutely. Now, in terms of why I decided to go into history and not to become a chemist or a physicist or something like this, it's because I was very interested in my own family's history with regard to specifically Armenia, and also with regard to Soviet Armenia and socialism and that kind of a thing. I mean, my family, they were Armenians from Romania, and my father's side, he was an Armenian from Romania. And he grew up under socialism in Romania, state socialism in Romania. And so for me, always not Ceausescu, it was Gorghidesh. And we were talking about the 50s. And but they were able to leave Romania because my grandfather and my grandmother were non-Sen passport holders. So because of that, they were from the genocide. They fled from the genocide. They went to Constanța, Romania. Then they went to Bucharest, which is where they got married. They met and married, and then they had my father, but my father, even though he was I guess you could say eligible for Romanian citizenship, he went with them because they were able to leave. my grandfather, as I say in the acknowledgments, he really was very impressed by, at the time, he was very impressed by the West, by the United States. He thought America was a land of gold, where the streets are paved with gold, milk and honey, land of milk and honey. And so he decided to take his family and leave Romania. First, actually, they were in Beirut, Lebanon for a year. Actually, specifically, Borj Hamoud. So really, technically, almost like separate from Beirut. I mean, like its own separate kind of community. But after that, then they left and they went to America. They went to Queens, New York. And then they eventually went to Cleveland, Ohio. And my grandfather famously said when he came to America, "This is America?" He couldn't believe the reality of what America really was. Because all this time he believed, based on what his friends were telling him in Romania, that this is the land of milk and honey. This is a miracle land and everything. And by the way, it's interesting because speaking of Romania, my uncle was also at the University of Bucharest. He was roommates with the Catholicos Vazgen I when he was a philosophy student. So there's a lot of history there. But
how small is the world?
Absolutely. But I was always interested in this history of communism in Armenians, socialism in Armenians, and I was interested in the history of the Russian Revolution. So that's what led me to want to learn more about Soviet Armenia, and also because so much of the legacy of our Armenia today is from the Soviet past. We can't escape it. And that's how I eventually came to this history with Mikoyan. But like I said, with Mikoyan, I was surprised at how involved he was with Armenian affairs. I really was. I didn't think he was this involved. Part of the reason why this history is kind of secret is because of Mikoyan himself. Why? Because he didn't want to show to other nationalities in the Soviet Union that he was maybe biased toward Armenians. There's a very famous anecdote, by the way, where you have, again, this is Yegashe Asatryan, who was saying to me basically that Uzbekistan had a extra allocation of cement, and they needed the signature of Kosygin to release the cement to Armenia because Armenia needed cement. And Kosygin was in Sochi on vacation, and he couldn't do this. He couldn't sign the document, or couldn't sign it right away. They couldn't get a hold of him. So basically, they turned to Mikoyan, and Mikoyan said, what is this? I can't sign this because I'm Armenian, and if I sign it, then the Uzbeks will say that the Armenian Mikoyan took the cement from the Uzbeks and gave it to the Armenians. So we can't have this. I can't sign it. It's up to Kosygin to sign it. So Kosygin was the one in the end. They got to him eventually in Sochi, and he signed it, and then the cement was released. But that's why today we have these kind of narratives in Armenia where, what did Mikoyan do for Armenia? Nothing. That's what I mean, actually, they don't even need to say nothing. They just imply that what did he do? He didn't do anything, right? Or you have these kind of crazy stories, like he was playing backgammon with his brother Artyom, and they talk about the Artsakh issue, and then basically Mikoyan said something about Artsakh, and then Artyom got so angry he took the backgammon board and hit his brother on the head with it. It's major exaggeration in terms of also their relations, even. Because you have to think, even at the 20th Party Congress, there's a very famous story where Mikoyan was the first person at the 20th Party Congress in 1956 to condemn Stalin, even before Khrushchev's speech. He condemned Stalin's short course on history, where he said it wasn't adequately covering, let's say, the revolutionaries of the Baku Commune, like Stepan Chaumyan. And he was very critical of Stalin in the speech. And Artyom, after Mikoyan gave the speech, he took his brother aside and he said, Anastas, what is this? Why are you condemning Stalin so harshly? Many people didn't like that speech. I agree with what you said, but it's too harsh. Why would you say this? And Mikoyan said, well, look, it had to be said. And number two, watch out, because Khrushchev, he's going to say even worse things in the closed session. So they both Artyom and Anastas had an extraordinarily close relationship. There was not really any friction between them. Although I should say this, Artyom was the person who was skeptical of this, this Razdan Sevan Cascade project, this irrigation projects involving the waters of the Lake Sevan. First, Mikoyan, first Anastas, was for this project, but it was actually Artyom who persuaded his brother, this is negatively impacting Armenia. and that you should help the Armenian leadership with securing the resources for this Arpa Sivan tunnel. And it was Mikoyan who persuaded the Armenian leaders that when you talk to Khrushchev about this, because famously Yakov Zorobian sees Khrushchev, he meets with him in 1961 on Lake Sevan. They go on a boat called Mikoyan. They go on the Anastas Mikoyan boat. And what happens is Mikoyan told him, if you raise this issue with Khrushchev, just tell him the cost of the tunnel. Don't tell him the cost of the tunnel with the associated infrastructure, because then he'll go through the roof. And you'll never get the funding from Moscow if that happens. In addition, tell him that Armenia, the Soviet Armenia, will pay 30% of this project. It won't be all you. It won't be all you from Moscow. 30% of the budget will be covered by Soviet Armenia. Right? So these are the kind of negotiations that kind of went down. I mean, our readers can read more about this. I mean, Mikoyan was involved in projects certainly in Lori, in his native Sanain, in Alaverdi, in Rapan, all over the whole of the Republic of Armenia, all the way down to Agarak on the border with Iran. So this was somebody who was very, very in touch with the Armenian village life. Also, by the way, Artyom too, because Artyom also visited Armenia quite frequently. The brothers, in general, were very close to Armenia. And they were not, everybody thinks that it's like just what Mikoyan said about Adam Hachatorian. Adam Hachatorian actually went and told him about this story where he said that, many people are saying that, I'm a Moscow composer. I'm not a Yerevan composer. That I'm more oriented toward Moscow. And Mikoyan said, well, look, that's a wrong attitude to have. They should be respecting you. They should be appreciating for what you do. They shouldn't be judging you by the fact that, you're in the capital of our Soviet motherland, that kind of a thing. And this attitude, unfortunately, was extended to Anastas Ivanovich and also with Artyom Ivanovich, or Anushavan, because that was his original name, Anushavan. And so... but yeah, no, that's, I guess, kind of the history in a nutshell. I hope that fills in a lot of these gaps we had. And
thank you for this book, and we wish you all the very best with your work, and looking for your next project.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.